Okay, welcome back everyone to our discussion of weekly Haftarot. This week we have Zchut. It's Parashat Chanukah. It's Shabbos Parashat Chanukah. It's also Shabbos Parashat Rosh Chodesh, which yields an interesting discussion. Obviously, we're going to read the Haftarah from Zecharia of Rani v'Simchi bat Tzion, which is popular mostly because it's also the Haftarah for Shabbos Parashat Baaloscha. Now, on the face of it, obviously, the connection would be Baaloscha, the Parsha Baalotcha, Hanerot, Elmul Pnei HaMenora, Yair Yeshivat Hanerot. And so we borrow that Haftarah for Shabbos Parshas Chanukah. And the Gemara at the end of Megillah is clear that Shabbos Parshas Chanukah we read from the story of Zecharia. Zecharia is another one of the Nevi'im of the Trei Asar, although I think Zecharia is slightly more well-known than some of the others, but it raises an interesting question. The Gemara is clear that you read Rani v'Simchi for Shabbos Parshas Chanukah. But what about when this year, when Shabbos Parshas Chanukah is also Rosh Chodesh, right? Rosh Chodesh has its own Haftarah that we're supposed to read, Hashem Kisi. Yeah, it has its own. So which one do you pick? Do you pick Haftarah or do you pick Rosh Chodesh? Or do you pick Chanukah? So we know already that we pick Chanukah, but it's a fascinating question. And Tosos in Shabbos and Chav Gimel and Beis raises the issue, and he says, "V'nira l'rashba, kishachal Rosh Chodesh Tevet liyot b'Shabbat," as we'll have this Shabbos. Sheyesh lahaftir b'neirot Zecharia. They refer to our Haftarah as neirot Zecharia. Mishum persumei nisa. So he says, should we read Neros Chanukah, Neros of Zecharia, because of Persumei Nisa? V'lo ba'Hashem Kisi she'Haftarah Rosh Chodesh. And you don't read Hashem Kisi, which is the normal Haftarah that we would read on Rosh Chodesh. Right? Now, what's really the question? There's no doubt that between Rosh Chodesh and Chanukah, Rosh Chodesh is Tadir. So we have a rule of Tadir v'she'eino Tadir, Tadir Kodem. On the other hand, we have another rule, just came up in Daf Yomi, Mekudash v'she'eino Mekudash, Mekudash Kodem. And you would think that, not that Chanukah is more Mekudash than Shabbos, but the more unique Haftarah perhaps should be read. So Tosas says, no, we're going to read Zecharia, we're not going to read Hashem Kisi. Vod. Now why? Since the last Aliyah is reading of Chanukah, right? So you want to connect the Haftarah to the Maftir. So the Maftir is from Naso is Chanukah. So the Haftarah is also Chanukah. Rosh Chodesh mishum dekriyas haTorah kevan the matzil mevan travayu. Tadir u'persumei nisa abdinan travayu v'tadir kodem. Right? Since with respect to Torah reading, you have the parsha of the week, you have Rosh Chodesh, then you have Chanukah, so tadir v'shenon tadir kodem. But that rule implies to us is only when you can do both, tadir kodem. But what if you can only do one? Aval heichado ev shalom eva travayu, when you can't do both, like with respect to the Haftarah, then persumei nisa adif. Then really Mekudash rules out. The more specific, the one that's Persumei Nisa, the one for Chanukah, wins out. And that's how we do it. Now, there are different minhagim about, do you read one pasuk from Hashem Kisi? Do you read a paragraph from Hashem Kisi? It's not so simple, but the general rule is everybody's going to read Zecharia. Vod. The Kriyat HaTorah ain't kol kach Persumei Nisa she'eino mazkir ba'neirot kimo b'Haftarah. Also, with respect to laning, where the Gemara at the end of Megillah does have machlokas about which one you lane from, there it's not such Persumei Nisa, because they don't really talk about lighting the Menora. V'od nira l'rashba. The al kein niktimu shel Rosh Chodesh, k'dei she'amaftir yikra b'shel Chanukah, v'yaftir b'neirot de Zecharia. So it says the Rashba, that's really why they made the order, not just because of Tadir, but they want the last Aliyah on Shabbos, the last lading on Shabbos should be related to Chanukah, so that the Haftarah and the Maftir come together. Okay, now, one takeaway from Tosos, I think, is that Tosos assumes that reading Zecharia on Shabbos for the Haftara is the kiyum of Persume Nisa. It's not clear to me, at least, why that was so obvious to Tosfos. Yeah, Hadlakas Neras Chanukah is a recreation of the miracle. We're doing it for purposes of Persume Nisa. Reading Megillas Esther, we're doing it for purposes of Persume Nisa. Drinking Daled Kosos at the Seder, we're doing it for purposes of Persume Nisa. But here, Persume Nisa in Shul, I'm not sure. But Tosfos takes it as a given. At least one thing is clear. Tosfos thinks that Persume Nisa is for Jews, right? There are no Gentiles walking around the shul that I daven in. And so therefore, clearly Tosfos thinks that Persume Nisa is sort of within our crowd. Sometimes that comes up, who you're lighting for in your house. So if you live in Israel, obviously you're lighting for other Jews. But if you live in Chutz La'aretz, maybe you want to be mefarsim to other people. I'm not sure. The other thing that comes out of Tosfos is the fundamental hakira that we presented really in our first year, but we raise it from time to time, about what the purpose of the Haftara is. If it's to amplify Kriyas HaTorah, and there's supposed to be a direct connection between Kriyas HaTorah and the Haftara, okay, so it makes sense that after you read a Torah reading relating to Chanukah, you're going to read a Navi that relates to the same point. The point of Me'ein HaMa'orah, nobody claims that Zecharia has anything to do with Parshas Miketz, but it has something to do with Chanukah, right? So we're not doing it. The second piece is you're not doing it for purposes of elaning. You're doing it for purposes of current events. There's something in every Haftarah that relates to what we're going through as a people, as a Jewish people, as a community. And that's the whole idea of learning the Haftarah. We're supposed to learn a piece of Navi, even if we're not such Bekim in Nach. We're supposed to learn a piece of Navi and understand and see what lessons we can get out of it with respect to current events. And obviously we'll do that today. Okay? Now, the Haftarah is from Zecharia, so some background. Zecharia was a Navi who lived before Ezra and Nehemiah, but certainly at the end of the first Galus. So Zecharia is waiting to build the Beis HaMikdash. Maybe the Beis HaMikdash was already started in Zechariah's time, and its building was paused. That's the idea of Haftara. That's the idea of Zecharia. That's what Zecharia is there for. And Zecharia is speaking to us, generally speaking. Now, if you're Zecharia, and if you're speaking to the Jewish people towards the end of the first Galus, you're speaking, I don't want to say so directly, you're speaking to depressed people. You're speaking to people who feel rejected by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And what's worse is almost certainly the Jewish people felt responsible for Churban Bayis Rishon because the Jewish people were responsible for Churban Bayis Rishon. So Zecharia, he has to walk a fine line. You don't want to mislead us. You don't want to tell us everything's going to be fine, don't feel bad. We should feel bad. And Zecharia tries to walk that line at the very beginning of the Sefer, not in our Haftara. The Navi says, Katzaf Hashem al avotechem katzef. HaKadosh Baruch Hu was angry at you because you sinned. You should know that. Okay? But by our Haftara, things are really looking up. Says the Navi, Rani v'simchi bat Zion, ki hineni va v'shachanti v'tochech num Hashem. It's great. V'nilvu goyim rabim, and you have to understand, the first part of the Haftara is really addressed to the Gentiles. V'nilvu goyim rabim el Hashem bayom ahu v'hoyu li la'am. Right, people are going to return to God and return to Judaism. Gentiles will. V'shachanti b'tochech v'yadat ki Hashem tzvakot shalchani elayich. Right, it's going to be a great day. V'nachal Hashem et Yehuda chelko al admat hakodesh uvachar od b'Yerushalayim. God will choose once again in Yerushalayim as His chosen city. Haskol v'son b'nei Hashem ki ne'ami ma'on kadsho. Right, all basar will be quiet because God returns to His kedusha. So it's really a fantastic and a very uplifting Haftarah that starts here. The idea being that God is about to redeem the Jewish people and He's about to choose Yerushalayim again. Okay? That's the first part of our Haftarah. That's the prophecy for the Gentiles. The second part of our Haftarah is to the Haftara, by the way, is exactly, just I mentioned a few weeks ago, it's curious to me, it's exactly 21 psukim long. And it's clear that it could have been longer and it could have been shorter, right? They chose 21 psukim. 21 psukim is, as I mentioned before, the optimum. It's supposed to be the minimum, but sometimes it serves as the maximum size of any Haftara, right? You have to say, with respect to the Torah reading, the length of the parsha just depends on how long the parsha is. There are shorter ones, there are longer ones. But Haftara, we're not trying to finish Tanakh for Simchas Torah. We're just picking a piece of Tanakh. So it makes sense that Chazal picked, we already mentioned why 21 psukim is the optimal amount. So Chazal picked Nevuos, and often they add or subtract from it, so it becomes exactly 21 psukim. Okay, so the first part of the Haftara was simple. The second part of the Haftara is addressed not to the Gentiles, but to Yoshua Kohen Gadol. He was the Kohen Gadol at the time, and he was, of course, then the spiritual leader of the Jewish people. Okay? Now, when you tell good news to the Jewish people, so the question is, what did the Jewish people do to deserve it? Right? The Navi again said at the beginning of the Sefer, Shuvu Elai Neum Hashem Tzvakos, Va'ashuv Aleichem Amar Hashem Tzvakos. Right? You return to me, I'll return to you. That requires full tshuva. Are we really ready for the whole tshuva that the Navi calls for? It's hard to know. And that's what the Satan says. The Satan makes an appearance. First the pasuk says, Vayareini et Yoshua hakohen hagadol omed lifnei malach Hashem, v'hasatan omed al yamino l'sitino. Right? The Navi sees Yoshua Kohen Gadol standing in front of a malach Hashem, but the Satan is also there. Vayomer Hashem ala Satan. Obviously the Satan is against us. Vayomer Hashem ala Satan. Yigar Hashem b'cha Satan. He's warning the Satan. V'yigar Hashem b'cha abocher b'Yushalayim. Halo ze ud mutzal me'esh. Ud mutzal me'esh. It's actually, I remember in the shul I grew up in, shul in Teaneck, there was like some Holocaust memorial, and it said ud mutzal me'esh. Right? Literally, you're somebody saved from the fire. So it's like you imagine the Satan is saying to God, why would you favor these people? Why would you redeem them? Why would you build a new Beis HaMikdash? Why would you come back to Yerushalayim? They're not worthy. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to the Satan, maybe you're right. Right? There are two ways in which God can redeem the Jewish people. He can redeem us through tshuva, and maybe in this case we weren't really worthy of that tshuva, but sometimes God redeems us simply because we've suffered enough. For example, says the pasuk in Pasha Shmos, Vayomar Hashem ra'o ra'iti et ani ami Hashem Mitzrayim ve'tza'akatam shamati b'bnei gonosav ki yadati et machovav. I knew their pain. Va'irei lahatzilom miyad Mitzrayim u'laha'aloto min ha'aretz hahi el eretz tova rechava el eretz soat chalav udvash el mekom ha'knani v'ha'chiti v'ha'amori v'ha'prizi v'ha'chivi v'ha'yebusi. God doesn't say, I'm redeeming the people from Egypt because they deserve it. God says, I'm redeeming the people of Egypt because they've suffered from Egypt, because they've suffered enough. And in a way, that's what God says to the Satan. Right? The pasuk tells us. So first of all, Vayan vayoma Elohim dim lefanai lemar hasiru habigadim hatzoim me'alav. And you can't miss the fact. Bigadim tzoim speak to the fact that Yoshua, as a spiritual representative of the Jewish people, was dirty. He had sinned, or the Jewish people had sinned, and he's seen that way. You're going to wear clean clothing going forward. You're redeemed from your sins. Okay? Va'omar yosimu tzanif tahor al rosho, va'yosimu tzanif tahor al rosho, va'yabishu bigadim umalach Adonai omeid. Right? They give him a new turban, they give him clean clothing, and the Malach is standing there. And here we go. Vayar malach Adonai biyoshua leimor. Ko amar Adonai tzvaos. Im bidrachai telech. Vimes mishpati tishmor. V'gam ata todin et beiti. V'gam tishmor et chatzerai. V'natati lecha mahalchim bein ha'omdim ha'ela. if you do tshuva, says the Malach, I'll make it great for you. Shmana Yoshua Kohen Agadol Atav Re'echa Yoshim B'Fonecha Ki Anshe Mofet Hema Ki Hini Mevi Et Avdi Tzemach. And then I'm going to bring the Mashiach, Tzemach. It's all going to be good. Now, we say to ourselves, when we see this, it's so exciting, and it's so fantastic, and it's so wonderful. But we know the end of the story. We know that the second Beis HaMikdash was a pale comparison to the first Beis HaMikdash. We know that. And it's slightly sad when you see it, because God is saying, just do tshuva, and everything is going to be great. And we don't. And it's frustrating to read it. And when you see the opportunity that was not seized by the Jewish people, it's frustrating, right? It's almost like the Malach is saying, you can have real geula if you want it, but then we don't want it. And it's frustrating. Okay, fine. That's the second part of the Haftara. And then finally we come to the third and last part of the Haftara, and that's addressed to Zerubbabel. Who's Zerubbabel? Zerubbabel, right? Vahid v'Hashem Adai, that was Yiday's, I'm in the wrong place, sorry. Vayashem Malach Adon. We'll come to one second. Zerubbabel is the political leader of the Jewish people at the time. Okay? And Zerubbabel is, I guess, balanced against Yoshua Kohen Gadol. Yoshua Kohen Gadol is the spiritual leader of the Jewish people. Zerubbabel is the political leader of the Jewish people. And so the third part of the Haftara addresses the political leader of the Jewish people. And the point is as follows. You're supposed to understand that there are two ways that the Jewish people can go. They can go with the political leader, they can go with the spiritual leader. Now, sometimes both those leaders work together, and it's wonderful, right? But what does he see? So the vision that the Navi sees, or in the words of the Navi, the vision that Zerubbabel sees, is a menorah surrounded by two zaytim. So let's see. Vayashav hamalach hadover bi vayareini ki ish asher yom mishnato. Vayomer elai, ma Torah? Va'omar ra'iti v'hinei menorat zahav kula v'gula al rosha v'shiva neroteh aleha shiva v'shiva mutzakot lanerot asher al rosha. A 7-branched, like in the Beis HaMikdash, a 7-branched menorah. Ushnayim zaytim aleha. And there are two that are described as zaytim, but we understand them to be like kind of bowls. Echad mimin hagula v'echad al smona, on either side. Va'an v'omar lamalach hadover bi lemar. Ma'ela Adoni. And the Malach explains that the oil will flow or drip into the two bowls, and that oil will light the menorah. Right? It's almost like a self-lighting menorah. And that's exactly the point. And that brings us to Hanukkah. Now, the Rambam, there's something unique about the Chashmonaim, right? Bimei Matzo ben Yochanan, Kohen Gadol, Chashmoni Uvanav. The Chashmonaim were also Kohanim. But, says the Rambam, I'm reading from the end of Parak Gimel Halacha Aleph of Hilchos Megillah v'Chanukah. V'ha'emidu melach min ha-kohanim. The priests appointed a king from the priesthood. V'chazra malchut l'Yisrael yeter al 200 shana ad ha'churban hasheni. And then we had political sovereignty for give or take 200 years until the second Beis HaMikdash. Okay, a whole thing to discuss there. What's the point of celebrating 200 years of sovereignty? Much to discuss. But the Rambam presents it as a fact. I don't think, my sense is the Rambam's not endorsing it, but the Rambam's presenting it as a fact. But the Ramban doesn't like this at all. The Ramban thinks that this is a violation of the pasuk in Parshas Vayechi of Lo Yasur Shev Miyudav U'Mechokek Ben Raglav Ad Ki Yavo Shilo V'Lo Yikatamim. What does that mean? Says the Ramban in the middle of in his perush on that pasuk, in the middle of his perush, V'zeh haya onesh hachashmonaim shemalchu b'ayit sheni. This is the sin of the Chashmonaim and their punishment who ruled during Bayit Sheni. Ki hayu chasidei elyon. Says the Raman, I loved the Chashmonaim. They were big chasidim. They were fantastic. V'il malehem, and had they not stepped up when they did, nishtakchu haTorah v'hamitzvot miYisrael. We would have lost the Torah completely. V'afal pikein ne'enshu onesh gadol. Says the Ramban, but they were punished terribly. Why? Ki arbat bnei Chashmonai hazakein hachasidim hamolochim zeh achar zeh im kol gvuratam atzlachatam naflu biyad oivehem b'charev. Nevertheless, says Raman, since they violated this pasuk of Lo Yasur Shevet Mihuda, that the political leadership of Am Yisrael has to come from Shevet Yehuda, they were punished. V'yigia ha'onesh basof l'ma shamu v'chazal kol man da'ama mibeis Chashmonai kasina. Anybody who says I'm a descendant of the Chashmonaim, avdahu, is a slave. Shenichrusu kulam ba'avon hazeh, because the entire group of Chashmonaim were punished for this sin. What's this sin? This sin is, in Judaism, and we don't think about it that often, but we should, this is a separation of powers. There's religious leadership, that's the Kohen Gadol. There's political leadership, that's the Melech, or that's whoever's ruling at the time, right? Now, it's not a bright line distinction. David HaMelech had an enormous amount to do with building the Beis HaMikdash. David HaMelech was a political leader. Nevertheless, he loved the religious side. David HaMelech wrote to him, he was as religious as it gets. And obviously, the more the political leader is religious, and sometimes the more the religious leader has a hand in politics, the better it's going to be for all of us. But the idea is supposed to be that they're separated. And the idea is supposed to be that there's a person who deals with the politics, and there's a person who deals with the religion. And those two are separate, and it makes complete sense, right? You want to believe that the person who's taking us to war is doing it al pi Hashem. And so if David HaMelech himself says it's al pi Hashem, there's reason that he has self-interest. But if David HaMelech goes to the Kohen Gadol and the Urim B'tumim says, go to war, then that's the answer. Then there'd be no one that disagrees with that. That's how it's supposed to work. We're supposed to have religious people who have some political sense, and we're supposed to have political people who have religious sense. And that's kind of the end of a Haftara. Says the Pasuk, Vayan vayomer ilai lemor, Zed dvar Adonai el Zerubbabel lemor, Lo b'chayil, v'lo b'koach, Kim beruchi amar Adonai tzvaos. Now, I don't think it really means literally Lo b'chayil, v'lo b'koach. More or less it means Lo rak b'chayil, v'lo rak b'koach. It's not just with force. It's not just with human initiative. In the end, it's HaKadosh Baruch Hu who decides our future. And, it's so obvious what the message is for us nowadays, right? Charedim are right on this point. It's HaKadosh Baruch Hu who decides. But says the Pasuk, you have an army, you have political force, you have to do all the things you have to do. And then HaKadosh Baruch Hu will continue, and then HaKadosh Baruch Hu will do what he has to do. And it's the same message for Hanukkah. The Chashmonaim could have just said, listen, it's hard. If HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to save us, he'll save us. But they didn't do that. They took it upon themselves to fight. Rabim biyad matim, twaim biyad horim, rishayim biyad tzadikim. They took it upon themselves to challenge the ruling authority, and they won. Now, says the Ram, it's only for 200 years, and the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, and that's obviously the history. But there's a sense of an incremental miracle, right? We're not celebrating the total geula, and maybe this is the point of the Haftara. There's a geula that's temporary. There's a geula that's less than the total geula, but that's still worth celebrating. And much like the miracle of Hanukkah is a temporary miracle, even though we celebrate it, incredibly well, and we love Hanukkah, and nobody more than me, but it's temporary. Says the Haftara, okay, temporary things are worth celebrating as well. If we were better, it's true. We would have done full tshuva, and God would have returned to us, and Bayis Sheni would have been like Bayis Rishon, and our history would have been different. Nevertheless, it's still worth celebrating. It's still worth feeling accomplished, feeling like God loves us, and feeling that God wants us to do well, and God saved us. If not in the zchus of full tshuva, He saved us as ud mutzal me'esh. We suffered enough, the feeling is in modern times also, we've suffered enough. We're suffering nowadays. The anti-Semitism is horrible, but we have what we have. We have the political leadership. We have religious leadership, not exactly as described by the Navi, but it exists, and God willing, we will do complete tshuva and will be zocha for the ultimate and the full, real redemption. Shabbat Shalom, Chanukah Sameach, and see you next week.